So last time we discussed the first part of the evolution, species interactions, and biological communities lecture. In that lecture, we discussed natural selection as the mechanism for biological evolution. We discussed agents of that natural selection, agents being competitive exclusion, competition, intra and interspecific competition, predation, things of that nature. We also talked about the types of selection and the types of speciation. We discussed taxonomy, the hierarchical classification of living things, community interactions, including symbioses. So today we'll discuss part 2. The first thing we need to address is growth in a biological organism without limits is exponential. What we mean by this is we have population growth where there's virtually no limits and endless resources. This ends up in what we call a J-shaped curve, which we'll take a look at in upcoming slides. But as we all recognize in the real world, there are actually limits to growth, limits such as food resources, shelter resources, and even mates. The limit at which an ecosystem can carry species is called the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity suggests a limit of sustainability that an environment has in relation to the size of a species population. This population dynamic is called logistic growth because of its changes in growth rate over time. So what this looks like is here. Here we have a graph of exponential population growth described as a J-shaped curve. See how through time, the population size of these elk, for example, if we had no limits on resources in the environment, would quickly swoop up. At some point, they overshoot the carrying capacity or the number of individuals that an environment can hold. And so they die off because there are just far too many of them to be sustained in that environment. They then die and resurge, die and resurge. What is more typical, though, is this carrying capacity, where you can notice on this y-axis, the number of individuals stays relatively the same through time. And this is achieved in a relatively short time because, as you can see, the population grows super fast. It has to fall down because of these interactions between members of the same population. The logistic growth curve is more of what we see in nature. This has a different shape than the exponential curve, that J-shaped curve, because it reaches this K term, which is the carrying capacity. So unlike the J-shaped curve, which characterizes exponential growth, logistic growth is characterized by an S, or a sigmoidal shaped curve. This describes a population whose growth rate may decrease if its numbers approach or exceed that carrying capacity. You also have species interactions that maintain that carrying capacity. Here we have the canonical example of the snowshoe hare and its predator, the Canada lynx. We can trace population numbers through time for these two populations, the snow hare and the lynx. Here we have the hare outlined in purple and the lynx, its predator, outlined in red. So tracing through the years, if we were to examine the population size in thousands, we see that the boom and bust cycles of these two populations are largely in sync with each other. When you have an increase in hares, well, then there's more prey for the lynx. So we have a boom in the lynx population that lags just a little bit behind the hare. But once you have that boom in the predator population, that drives the hare numbers way down. And so in turn, the lynx numbers are then driven down because they don't have nearly enough prey to sustain their population. So the cyclical variation between the predator and prey is typical of these types of relationships. The boom and the bust are largely tied to each other. There are limits to population growth outside of predator-prey relationships. There are environmental limits that can control growth by altering birth and death rates. There are two different types of these environmental limitations. First, density-dependent factors. This is tied to predator-prey relationships in the case of resource competition for food, but density-dependent factors also include other things like more rampant disease. The larger the population, the more susceptible that population is to disease. If you have a large population, you're going to have increased competition for mates and shelter. There's also going to be higher instances of predation as well as waste buildup. So all of these we define as density-dependent factors. Density meaning the number of individuals within a population. We also have density-independent factors, which are more tied to natural disasters, things that really don't care how big the population size is. A hurricane, for example, will sweep in and decimate a population. But what we need to recognize is that there are interactions between density-dependent and density-independent factors. And a key example of this is during the last ice age, woolly mammoth populations were on the decline. They were running out of food, they were pretty scarce. And so once we had a huge climatic shift to a warmer climate, those already low numbers in the woolly mammoth population didn't stand a chance to withstand those large climatic changes. So therefore, the woolly mammoth went extinct. Something that ties into population growth is the idea of a species' life history. And a species' life history is genetically determined and shaped by the environment as well as natural selection. One part of a species' life history is the frequency of reproductive events during that animal's lifetime. Some animals reproduce multiple times in their lifetime. Sometimes they can only reproduce one time. And we have special words to characterize those different life histories. First, we have semal parity. Semal parity occurs when a species reproduces only once during its lifetime and then it dies. An example of this is the salmon, which has programmed suicide to provide offspring a food source after they die. Here. Heteroparity is the opposite of that. This describes a species that reproduces repeatedly during its lifetime. This reproductive event could be triggered by going into heat or a estrus cycle, or it could just happen anytime during its life. Fecundity is a special term for the reproductive capacity of an individual within a population, and it is directly tied to the number of reproductive events during its life. This idea of life history can also translate into different selective strategies. We have two of them. We have K-selected versus R-selected species. This is tied into the reproductive strategies as we just talked about, but it's also tied to other extrinsic factors outside of how much they reproduce. This also ties into their habitat, for example, and their behavior. In essence, how they acquire their resources, how they rear their young, and the length of their life. And here it's really a spectrum of K-selected versus R-selected species. I like to remember this as K-selected species are trying to maintain that carrying capacity, the most efficient number of individuals within a population, versus R-selected species, which are trying to increase the rate of the number of offspring that they can produce. So over here on the right, as we'll talk about on the next slide, a great example of a K-selected species is the chimpanzee. Over here on the left, an R-selected species, an example is an oyster. Both of these have very different life strategies. The chimpanzee, the K-selected species, reproduces once about every 5 years. Compare that to the oyster, which produces as many as 500 million offspring in that single year. Okay, so this does fall on a spectrum. So taking a deeper dive into the K-selected species, as I just mentioned, characterized by our chimpanzee friends, these are characterized by living in a stable, predictable environment. They want that stable, predictable environment because they want to exist close to their carrying capacity, hence the term K-selected. They do have high intra-specific competition. So remember, intra means within a species. They have few offspring, but those offspring end up being very large because there's a long gestational period and there's a whole lot of care after that individual is born post-birth. So there's a lot of investment on the part of the parents to make sure that that one offspring actually survives to adulthood. And of course, they require this long-term care because the offspring that's produced is immature at birth. Now, in contrast to the K-selected species, we have R-selected species. These individuals live in unpredictable, unstable environments. They have a large number of offspring that are relatively small in size, so a large number increasing the rate of offspring output, hence the R designation. There's often little to no long-term parental care because the offspring are pretty self-sufficient at birth. There's not a lot of parental investment and energy that has to be expended on those offspring. Another thing that's tied to a species' life strategy and life history is a survivorship curve. Here we have different survivorship curves. These are idealized survivorship curves. We have 3 different types. The first type, typified by our elephant friends. If we take a look at age, so 100% over here, meaning 100% of the life expectancy, and the number of individuals on log scale on the y-axis, we see that in a type 1 survivorship curve, most individuals die later in their life, okay? So the number of individuals remains pretty steady until they reach a certain age and then it falls off. Okay, so type 1, most individuals die late in life. Type 2, typified by many bird species, the individuals die at a pretty uniform rate. It doesn't really matter how old that individual is, it has the same chance of dying. So that is type 2. Type 3, most individuals will die at a young age. This is the opposite of the type 1 in that we have a precipitous drop-off early in their lifetime, and very few individuals will survive to a late life. So these are our idealized survivorship curves. So moving away from life strategies and life histories, let's talk about things at the community level. We have this idea of diversity and abundance. So diversity is defined as the number of different species in an area or the number per unit area, just depending upon how big of an area that you're looking at. As a general rule, species diversity is greatest at the equator and it drops off the nearer you get to the poles. Though the number of species is lower near the poles, the abundance of particular species can be pretty high. So abundance refers to the number of individuals of a particular species or of a group in an area. Here we have an example of some sea creatures. We've got 5 species here with a sea star. It looks like some sort of jellyfish relative, a mollusk relative, something that again looks like a coral relative, and then a jellyfish relative. So you can see that we have a diversity of 5 different species, but not all of these species are of the same abundance. For example, species D only has 2 members in the community, and species C has 6. So these are far more abundant than species D, but the overall community has 5 different species in it. Diversity and abundance are often related. So communities with high diversity often have few individuals of one species, meaning that it's a pretty even community. There's lots and lots of diversity, and all of those members are in about equal abundance. However, most communities contain few common species and many, many rarer ones. So this would be a community where there are lots of different types of species, but it's really dominated by 1 or 2 types of species. Individuals and communities are distributed in various ways. This makes up the entire community structure of that ecosystem. The community structure has to do with spatial patterns, and we have different types of spatial patterns that we observe in nature. First, we have randomly distributed populations. This is where resources are often abundant, and so individuals can live wherever chance allows them to settle. We then have ordered or uniform patterns that arise through competition and territoriality. And then finally, we have patchy patterns of distribution of individuals. These result when a species clump together either for protection or mutual assistance or reproduction. So taking a look at different examples of these community dispersal patterns, we have random distributions typified by plants, for example. They grow wherever they can settle and find resources to support their growth. Next, we have the uniform pattern. The territorial birds are really good at forming this uniform pattern. And this is an example of penguins who have to make their nest. So they fight it out for nest space, and they space it out just so they are just out of reach of their neighbor. So this is spawned by behavior that makes them situate themselves in this uniform way. And then finally, we have clustered or clumped or patchy distribution patterns. You might bring to mind schools of fish, for example. Schools of fish clump together. They are a school, so by definition, they're a clump of different individuals within a species, and they do this for protection. They can easily spot predators, and if a predator was to pick one of them off, by clumping together, they reduce their chances that they're going to be the one that gets picked off. You can also have the vertical distribution of species in a community. And a great example of this is forests. So forests, for instance, have many different layers, each with different environmental conditions and combinations of species. You'll have at these different layers, different communities of plants, animals, and microbes that can live in the treetops, in the canopy layer, in the understory, in the shrub, or even the ground layer. This is called vertical stratification. And of course, it's best developed in our tropical rainforests. You also have communities that form patterns in a landscape. So most landscapes exhibit patchiness in some sort of way. The largest patches contain what we call core habitats. These core habitats are relatively uniform environments that are free from influence from the edges, which are depicted here in lighter green. So core habitats are large patches of habitat that are relatively uniform, free from the influence of edges. And coupled to this, we have something called edge effects, where communities meet. And where these communities meet, the environmental conditions kind of blend, and the species and microclimate of one community can penetrate into another. You sometimes have a community that's entirely edge habitat. And these habitats typically contain generalist species, those that don't have specific requirements for food or shelter, for example. While core habitats are really where specialists thrive. They need a stable environment to carry out their life and find mates and live successfully. An example of this is the northern spotted owl. They are a specialist that requires a core area. They nest in the interior of these large patches of mature coniferous forests in the Pacific Northwest. And if you put them in an edge habitat, they really don't do well. It's because of their nature. They require about 1,000 hectares of core habitat to survive. So you can imagine the devastating effects that fragmentation of habitats through deforestation and other human practices is having on species like the spotted owl that require these undisturbed core areas to live their life. Resilience of a community seems to be tied to the complexity of that community. And complexity refers to the number of different trophic levels in a community and the number of species at each of those trophic levels. There is a YouTube video for you to watch that describes what we mean by trophic levels. And it was first put forth by ecologist Robert MacArthur that the more complex a community is, the greater chance that community has of surviving through a disturbance. So a complex interconnected community might have trophic levels and groups of species performing the same function. Therefore, if one species were to die off, there's another species who can step in and take the place of that species in providing that ecological service. So the more complex a community, the more stability it has. There are different roles, as you can imagine, understanding trophic levels. There are different roles that each community member plays. The foundation of any community are primary producers. We call them primary producers because they are the first source of energy within a community, and they produce biomass through photosynthesis. There are also other types of primary producers that don't use light for energy. They use other inorganic chemical means. But for the sake of simplicity in this class, we'll just talk about plants and algae that produce biomass by converting solar energy into sugars in their body. We express primary productivity as units of biomass or energy per unit area per year. And of course, this productivity depends on things like light levels, temperature, moisture, and nutrient availability. And you can have drastic shifts in primary productivity among different ecosystem types. So tropical rainforests, coral reefs, and the bays and estuaries, for example, these all have high primary productivity because of the abundant energy and moisture that's available. You contrast the tropical forest environment to the deserts, for example, lack of water. It's going to limit photosynthesis, and therefore productivity is really low. So we can map out these different trophic levels in this way. Notice that it does not look like a stacked pyramid, as you may have seen before in the food chain models. We are now shifting our thinking more towards a food web, where there are many different individual species represented in each trophic level, some of them even staying within the same trophic level and feeding on things within the same trophic level. But all of these communities are based on those primary producers. As I mentioned before, biomass accumulates at different rates in the world's major ecosystem types, and differences in net primary productivity is chiefly due to environmental conditions like rainfall per year, temperature, nutrient availability. Interactions among species can also boost productivity. So here we have on the x-axis thousands of kilocalories meter squared per year, and you'll see that some of the most productive environments are those that are tropical rainforests, coral reefs, and estuaries. And when we get to our deserts, it's really not much. It's even lower than tundra and high mountainous regions. Next, we will talk about succession. Succession is a process in which organisms occupy a site and change its environmental conditions, gradually making way for another type of community. We have primary succession. This is depicted here. This is a volcanic lava flow, and this little plant is the first living thing to colonize this new environment. And we call these colonizers pioneer species. Okay, so in primary succession, newly exposed land like this is colonized by pioneer species. We also have a different type of succession that is made possible by primary succession called secondary succession. Secondary succession occurs after a disturbance when a new community develops from the biological legacy of the previous ones. So in both types of succession, organisms change the environment through a number of different ways. This can be by modifying soil or light levels, food and water supplies, or even change the microclimate itself. All in all, this change permits a new species to colonize and eventually replace the previous species. This is called ecological development or facilitation. And this is made apparent in this figure here. So on the left is the time when we have a newly exposed area, so new rocks. We go through time, eventually reaching the climax community. But in order to get there, you have to have this pioneering community, like lichens or mosses. These then make the way for grasses, herbs, shrubs, and tree seedlings, eventually allowing that ecosystem to support the climax community of balsam fir and birch. So primary succession in a boreal forest, for example, involves 5 main stages. These are depicted here. So initially, we have those pioneering species of the lichens. These trap moisture and build soil for the shrubs, the seedlings. You can also have periodic fires that can set back trees, but this can also initiate secondary succession. So aspens, for example, spring back from roots. Pines will germinate in new openings created by a fire, and a new forest begins. So this goes to show that some communities depend on disturbance to thrive. So ecologically, a disturbance is any force that disrupts the established patterns of species diversity, abundance, community structure, or community properties. And ecologists have found that disturbances benefit many species, kind of like predation does, because it sets back the most competitive species and allows less competitive species to persist in the environment. So an example of this is in the northern deciduous forests, maple trees like the sugar maple, they're more prolific seeders and more shade tolerant than a lot of other tree species. So they themselves as a species are more resilient, more hardy. After decades without a disturbance, those maple trees are going to completely outcompete other trees for a place in the forest canopy. They create really dense shade, and that makes it really, really hard for other species to compete for light. This is, going to affect oak populations, hickory populations, and other light requiring trees. Therefore, those populations are going to diminish in abundance while the maple tree persists and thrives and continues to populate its seeds around. But when we have a disturbance like windstorms or tornadoes, wildfires, something that is going to topple those maple trees down, those other trees like the oak are going to be finally given a chance. So this stimulates the seedlings of oaks and hickories and other understory plants. This breaks the grip of that maple tree on the entire community as the strongest competitor. So this disturbance will help facilitate the growth and increase in biodiversity in that forest. So we have found that those species like the oak and the hickory, they can benefit from these ecological disturbances. And we call these species disturbance adapted species. In order for them to thrive, they have to have some sort of disturbance in the ecosystem to take out their competition.